Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Norwegian Commercial Club's April meeting. My name is Eric Peel, and I'll introduce you to our president, Debbie Larson, and I'll turn the program over to her.
Welcome, everyone. Today is April 22nd, and I am, due to circumstances, we are all joining you remotely tonight. So thanks for joining us. So earlier this month, on April 8th, after our board meeting, we did have a Zoom social hour. We didn't have too many join us after the board meeting was over, but we had a good time. We're sorry if you didn't get the information soon enough, but next month or possibly later, we hope to have some kind of in-person meeting. And so stay posted for that. Now, due to the fact that I'm not at the lodge with the bell, I'm not going to be able to ring the bell tonight, but we will now observe a moment of silence for those members who have passed away, in memory of those members who have passed away since we last met. Tonight, we remember longtime Norwegian Commercial Club member Olav Leland. We also remember member of the NCC family and also owner of Ballard Oil, Debbie Millard, who passed away earlier this week. Thank you. So I have an update for you about the 17 Mai, May 17th festivities. We will be having a virtual luncheon starting at 11:30 on the day of the event. You'll get more information about this, but it will include a recording from this year's Grand Marshal, Marte Mjøs Persson, the mayor of our sister city in Bergen, and our honorary marshal and director, CEO of the National Nordic Museum, Erik Nelson. There will be songs and toasts, and hopefully entertaining for people to stay at home and watch. While watching, they can enjoy traditional Norwegian foods from a lunchbox that can be ordered at Scandinavian Specialties. By phone, the orders are 206-784-7020 and can be picked up the day of or the day before. And at 4 p.m. will be the start of a car parade that will include a maximum of 50 cars. So that will be by invitation only. And again, more information on that and the route for the parade, we'll get that out to you later. And at 5 p.m., there will be a small parade walking on the sidewalks from Scandinavian Specialties, where they will be selling pølse, lompe, etc. all afternoon in their parking lot. And they will arrive at Skål Beer Hall in downtown Ballard. And we will also provide more information and the routes for that later. There will be special events at the National Nordic Museum. They will be open that Monday. Even though they're not usually open Mondays, they will be open that day. It's a special day. So it's going to be an exciting day, and we're promoting everyone to wear their bunads and wave their flags anywhere in Ballard that day. So that will be fun. We'd also like to get input from you regarding Norwegian Commercial Club for future meetings. So when we are hopefully able to meet again in the fall, we are trying to attract more people, especially the younger generation. And we realize we do need to change with the times. We're considering the possibility of having the traditional social hour followed by dinner and a speaker on the second Thursday of the month, and then have a social hour and business networking time with hors d'oeuvres served on the fourth Thursday of the month. So we would like your thoughts. So please email us at nccseattle@gmail.com. So that's nccseattle@gmail.com. And another thing is the slate of officers for the membership to vote on is almost complete, but when it's finalized, we will send out the names and we'll follow up with virtual voting. So please stay posted for that information. Now I'm going to hand it over to our treasurer Corey Nelson, to give us an update about membership, finances, and donations, scholarships. And just so you know, at the end of this meeting, we normally go back to a drawing. And since we're not at the lodge tonight, we will not have that drawing. So I'm turning it over to Corey, and Eric will close out the meeting after our speaker. Thank you very much.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in tonight. The first thing I've got is donations. So we've gotten some donations in, which has been fantastic. We'd like to get a little bit more. We're coming up on that kind of that donation season when we all give it out. So we're starting to talk about who we're going to give it to. Yeah, there's two ways of doing that, really. It's through our website. It's probably the easiest. It's an easy little PayPal button on there. And then otherwise, you could always just mail in a check as well, and we'll get that. So I appreciate everybody who has donated to this. We've raised just shy of about, with our matching funds, about $2,500 that we'll be able to give out. So we'd like to give a little bit more this year. The other thing I want to go over, and this is the big thing right now, the thing that we really need to push for is get some scholarship applicants in. So we've had that open for a while. We've only gotten a few in. We need some more. So anybody you know who's in school, who could use some extra tuition money, I highly encourage them to apply. It's pretty easy. The forms are, of course, on our website. So anyway, that's all I got for tonight. Thanks again for tuning in. I'm excited for tonight's program. Appreciate it. I hope to see you guys soon.
Thank you so much, Corey. And now I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker tonight, Knute Berger. He is Crosscut's editor-at-large and host of the Mossback Northwest TV series on KCTS 9. Some of you may have seen that. If you haven't, look for those. He writes about politics and regional heritage. He's editor-at-large for Seattle Magazine and has written 2 books, Pugetopolis and Space Needle, The Spirit of Seattle. You may have heard him on public radio sometimes, as he is a regular commentator on KUOW FM. And most importantly, Knute's grandfather is from Northern Norway, so you know that what he's going to tell us tonight is the truth and nothing but the truth. Anyway, Knute, welcome to the Norwegian Commercial Club. It's great to have you here. Really appreciate your being here. Thank you.
Well, Eric, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be part of it. It's fun to hear about those Sitnamai plans. My grandfather, Knute the First, I'm the third of 4 Knutes. He died before I was born, but my grandmother kept Norwegian traditions alive in her home. We had lutefisk at Christmas and celebrated Sitnamai. In fact, I think I was probably in high school before I realized that Sitnamai wasn't an American holiday. I thought everybody celebrated it, and they should. I'm going to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint. Oh, the host has disabled screen sharing. Can I get screen sharing so I can share my PowerPoint?
Yes, sorry about that.
Yeah, no sweat.
Should work now.
Ah, there it is. And we'll go to slideshow. Okay, I hope everybody can see that. So we've obviously been going through a difficult stretch, both internationally, nationally, and here in Seattle with the pandemic and related social issues. And yeah, one of my sort of beat at writing for Crosscut and doing historical TV shorts for KCTS9, Mossbacks Northwest, is always I'm trying to look for something useful for the present in the past. And so my talk tonight is, I think, an example of how history, our local history, can teach us some lessons. In this case, the title of my talk is Troubles in Yeslerville, A Short History of Seattle in Crisis and Recovery. The Denny Party arrived in what became Seattle in mid-November of 1851. They set off a crisis for the Salish people of Puget Sound. What happened with the new arrivals had dreadful consequences for Native peoples. But the focus of my presentation begins with the crises in the American settlement that started with that arrival. The shaping of the land from a log settlement into a major city. One could say this town's first crisis was a crisis of confidence, and it took place at the landing itself. The Denny Party's beaching at Alki faced immediate challenges. Shelter for the newcomers was unfinished. The boat landed at low tide. Everything had to, and everyone had to slog through the muck and mud. It was pouring rain. It was November in Seattle. I think we can all relate. Oh, and the wives were said to be exhausted, and there was also said to be much weeping. Needless to say, it was a miserable day for all involved. But our urban challenges since have not been rare and have sometimes felt existential in nature. I'm going to run through some of those crises today and how we recovered or not from them. We're facing huge challenges as we sit here, but we are not alone in history. Our first crisis was Tacoma. Yes, Tacoma has long been an arch rival of Seattle, and that stems from the belief early in the settlement phase that there would be only one major city on Puget Sound, and no one quite had dibs on that title. Tacoma, Seattle, Bellingham, Kirkland, Olympia, Everett, Steilacoom, and even in the 19th century, Mukilteo could dream. If you look at the badge at the left, it says Tacoma, the city of destiny. And below that, where the rails first meet sails. You know, whoever came up with that slogan undoubtedly went to bed thinking they'd done a good day's PR work. The last reference about rails and sails is the crux of our first major crisis. Puget Sound cities were competing to be the terminus of the Transcontinental Railroad. Tacoma at Commencement Bay and Seattle and Elliott Bay were the two chief contenders wooing railroad barons of the Northern Pacific Railroad to drive their westernmost spike in their respective city. Seattle offered land, cash, and civic improvements to snag the railroad. Tacoma essentially allowed the Northern Pacific to design the whole town. Those of us who've watched Boeing and Amazon in action, getting cities and states to bid against each other with incentives and gifts will know something about civic competition to please the barons. But in 1873, a telegram from the railroad arrived in Seattle, and city co-founder Arthur Denny opened it and discovered the terminus had gone to our arch rival. It was automatically assumed that Tacoma, with the terminus, would be the destined #1 city, and Seattle, nothing more than a dead end. Tacoma gloated. The Tacoma Daily Ledger said, quote, "It is not a little astounding that the denizens of Yeslerville should, instead of promptly seizing their gripsacks and hieing with speed to the site of the future great city, continue to fancied security and idleness, to nurse the fond hope for the supremacy of Yeslerville." Yeslerville was, of course, a reference to Henry Yesler, Seattle's chief industrialist and property owner. Yeslerville was the equivalent of saying one horse town or Loserville. They could not imagine that anyone would stay in Seattle after that. And yes, Tacoma got the Northern Pacific terminus and began to boom as rails met sails. But it's what Seattle that did next that matters. I won't take you through the long tangled story of the railroads, but within months, the citizens of Seattle decided to fund and build their own railroad. And it was hoped a link to Eastern Washington. And thus was born the Seattle and Walla Walla Railroad, though it never made it to Eastern Washington. At an event kickoff, much of the town's citizens took up tools and literally began building the railroad like an old-fashioned barn raising. It was a symbolic gesture. Chinese laborers actually did most of the real work. Seattle had a thriving business in coal mining. In East Side places like Newcastle, Renton, Coal Creek, Issaquah, and putting the coal on train cars to the waterfront where the coal was shipped to supply heat and steam for the West Coast. Yes, Puget Sound's most successful late 19th century export wasn't timber, but coal. A new railroad made that journey more efficient, so more coal could be shipped, more ships came into Elliott Bay. In the picture on the right, you can see the coal train zipping across a railroad bridge built across the tide flats not far from where the Kingdome was later built to the coal bunkers on the waterfront. In addition, Seattle's own railroad encouraged more projects in the area to expand rail throughout Western Washington, and links across the Cascades were eagerly explored. Eventually, Seattle got a Northern Pacific spur, which cut into Tacoma's early advantage, and it attracted the Northern Pacific's competitor, the Great Northern Railroad. Seattle leaders became adept at wooing the robber barons with mixed results, but still the city's determination to build its own railroad showed it was dedicated and energetic and not going anywhere. In the end, Seattle won the rivalry with Tacoma. Afterwards, the effort was often boasted of having exhibited a unique civic trait known as the Seattle spirit. The next crisis, fire. Well, fires in Western cities in the 19th century were not uncommon. Ellensburg and Spokane burned the same year Seattle did. It was devastating. When Seattle burned, it burned 120 acres of the business district, wharves, warehouses, and rail terminals too. The Army was called in to prevent looting and unrest. On the plus side, an estimated 1 million rats died in the fire. So what were the fixes? No one questioned rebuilding the city. Civic leaders got together in a meeting to create new rules for the construction of New Seattle. As the PI headline here has it, the city bankers promised to fund rebuilding or seek funding from San Francisco and elsewhere as needed. Seattle got its first building regulations, and the position of building superintendent was created. In the burned zone, new buildings had to be of brick and stone, set further apart. Tall buildings had to be reinforced. Streets were to be widened. The whole district, what we now call Pioneer Square, was moved up 1 story. The fire department was revamped and new firehouses were built, and the department was professionalized. Prior to the fire, the city had relied on the tides to help flush sewage and supply firefighters with water. When the tide was out, water pressure dropped and hoses dried up, which was a problem actually during the fire. When the tide came in, it caused toilets to flush backwards like mini geysers. Woe to those sitting on the throne at that moment. Seattle took to improving its water supply. Shortly after the fire, voters approved the purchase of a private water supplier and redid its sewer and runoff systems. So the city took the opportunity of the fire crisis to take major steps to clean itself up, improve health and hygiene and physical resilience, and it stepped into the realm of public utilities. Public ownership of our water supply today is one long-term outcome of the fire. Crisis number 3, panic. Not all crises were of our own making. Not long after the Great Fire, an economic fire hit the country, the recession of 1893 to 97, the worst economic downturn to that point in the nation's history. Seattle, which was reliant on loans and real estate development, was not removed from the national crisis. It was felt here in a number of ways. The resource economy and railroads were hard hit. The Northern Pacific went bankrupt. The railroad speculation was partly to blame for the problems. Thousands of workers were laid off. The government gold reserves were being drained, which caused runs at the bank and bank closures. Silver prices crashed, which impacted the mining industry. David Denny, one of the city's founders, went bankrupt. An army of unemployed workers marched on Washington, D.C., so-called Coxey's Army, and you can see in the upper center photo is a picture of Coxey's Army, the Seattle contingent, gathering for their march. A British investor, shown here on the left, Peter Kirk, planned to make a city on Lake Washington into the Pittsburgh of the West. We know it as Kirkland. On the right is a picture of the Moss Bay Iron Works, which was part of his plan. Kirk saw potential with Kirkland having a water supply, proximity to mines as offering potential for a steelmaking metropolis. The Kirkland project died in the cradle as the investment capital vanished. It should be noted that Pittsburgh in the 1890s was the new model for modern cities. Just about everybody wanted to be Pittsburgh. So what got us out of that mess? Well, sounder economic policies, but the biggest factor here was the Klondike Gold Rush. With gold discovered in Alaska and Canada, when demand was high, it created an enormous economic opportunity for Seattle. The city's commitment to itself, as in 1873 when it started its own railroad, had paid off by increasing the city's manufacturing base and capabilities. In addition, a smart viral promotional campaign organized by Erastus Brainerd, working with the media and the Chamber of Commerce, pushed Seattle to the forefront of its rivals to be the launch pad for anybody going to the goldfields. Historian Roger Sale has written that it was Seattle's competitive edge, being able to manufacture what prospectors needed: hydraulic equipment, gold pans, sleeping bags, steamships, combined with self-promotion and proximity that allowed Seattle to gain the edge over San Francisco, Vancouver, Tacoma, Bellingham, Victoria, and other cities that were well-positioned for the gold rush. Seattle also had a long-standing reputation as a city of vice. The joke is that we got rich mining the miners. We sold them goods on their way to the Klondike. We encouraged them to drink, gamble, and patronize brothels with their winnings on the way home. Seattleites made fortunes. On the subject of brothels, it should be noted that the famed Seattle Madam, Lou Graham, she's shown here in the picture on the left, seated at the far left of the photograph. She ran an establishment that appealed to Seattle's upper crust men. She bailed out a number of Seattle businessmen with cash loans during the banking crisis of 1893. So there are likely some prominent families in the city today that benefited from Graham's generosity and Seattle spirit. Crisis number 4, pandemic. With today's COVID crisis, we can perhaps identify with Seattle of 1918 more than ever before. They say history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, and the rhymes we hear with the Spanish flu pandemic are as subtle as in a limerick. There was mandated social distancing, mask wearing, resistance to mask wearing, doctors giving conflicting public health advice, people trying to minimize the threat. There were treatments from quacks Whiskey, Vicks Vapo Rub, and vitamin B are not cures for the Spanish flu or COVID. There was fake news. The Spanish flu did not come to the United States on a German submarine. Oh, and it wasn't even Spanish. In fact, it might have started in America in rural Kansas. Much of these kinds of things are familiar to us today. The young man pictured here, by the way, was one of the victims in Seattle who died of the influenza in December of 1918, which is about when the epidemic was peaking here. He was buried at Lakeview Cemetery on Capitol Hill. Seattle had more than a serious case of influenza. In 1918, it had a few other things going on that broadened the crisis. The problem began before 1918 when the US entered World War I. It was a boom time for Seattle's economy. The war needed resources, men and materiel. The logging camps were busy, so were the mines, the shipyards, and the Army and Navy yards. Venereal disease had become epidemic in the city due to the marriage of vice and the military. Washington was cracking down on so-called fallen women. Alcohol sales were restricted due to new state prohibition laws. Seattle landlords and others were profiteering by jacking up rents. They were called rent hogs. Some even jacked up the price of coffins as the flu took hold. Labor strife was rife. The workers had agreed to defer higher wages for the war effort, but when the war ended, they wanted better pay. This in part led to the Seattle General Strike of March 1919. The city was effectively shut down for 6 days. And this, by the way, is still in the middle of the pandemic. The strike sent fear into business people all over America who worried that a new Bolshevik revolution was starting right here. The flu had hit Puget Sound in the fall of 1918. In early October, Seattle shut down for 5 weeks. Essential defense workers and services like drugstores remained open, but schools closed, church services were suspended, movie theaters, dance halls, billiard rooms, vaudeville houses were shut down. When the restrictions were lifted, premature victory against influenza was declared, but it resurged in the new year. War, influenza, rapid growth, profiteering, labor discontent, and attendant bad PR were all overlapping. This time, there wasn't an easy fix. Seattle did pretty well in terms of its mortality, better than many of its counterpart cities like San Francisco. While the flu lingered through the winter of 1921, it did eventually run its course. Just the numbers in the United States, nearly 700 people died from the Spanish flu. Worldwide, the toll was, well, the bottom number is 50 million, and it's been estimated as high as 100 million. Seattle's death rate during the height of the flu more than doubled. Around 5,000 to 6,000 people in Washington state died of the Spanish flu, and that's almost certainly an undercount. The war ended in November of 1918, and that ended things like food shortages, but economic issues lingered. Now here on the left is a picture, it's a rather glorious picture of Seattle's Mayor Ole Hansen. And Ole got Seattle through the general strike, which he blamed on labor radicals, even though it was mainstream unions that truly threw their weight into it. He gained a national reputation for beating the Red Menace and tried to run for president in 1920, but his 15 minutes of fame had expired. An anarchist bomb sent to the mayor's office helped convince him to resign and move to sunny California, which he did. He, by the way, was the son of Norwegian immigrant parents in Wisconsin. Seattle entered an economically stagnant period in the 1920s, but one with plenty of political and social bumps. The Ku Klux Klan came to the fore in the Northwest with large memberships in Seattle and Portland. Many people are surprised to hear that Klan rally of some 13,000 people was held in Issaquah in 1924, and a similar one near Renton, about the same size. New involuntary sterilization laws went into effect as part of eugenics legislation in Washington and Oregon to crack down on the unfit, meaning the disabled, gay people, and the chronically poor. Nationalism and anti-immigration laws were strengthened, and the so-called Centralia Massacre shootout between radical Union supporters and the American Legionnaires in 1919 signaled post-war tensions. Prohibition led to widespread corruption. Within a decade, a new problem arose. The stock market crash of 1929, the Great Depression began. Like the Panic of '93, this was a national event with strong regional impacts. Seattle had grown dramatically from the 1880s to the 1920s, but growth slowed to a crawl. The city gained only 2,700 residents between 1930 and 1940. Trade through the port declined. Unemployment grew dramatically, as symbolized by the vast Hooverville and what is now SoDo. Most of its inhabitants were unemployed laborers, loggers, railroad workers, fishermen, and farmers. Seattle's overall unemployment rate rose to nearly 27% by 1935. Labor strife also resurged with the shutdown of West Coast ports during the dock workers' strike of 1934. Seattle police deployed machine guns, gas, billy clubs to break the strike. The unions, however, won an eventual settlement. Still, there were mass meetings and protests by groups of the unemployed. Mayor John Doerr invited citizens to come to his office one day a week, and he dipped into his own pockets to help struggling families. So what fixed that crisis? Well, federal interventions, programs, and infrastructure proved to be game changers. Hundreds of federally funded projects took place. The Civilian Conservation Corps worked at improving parks, fighting wildfires, building lodges, campgrounds, and trails, improving forest lands. According to the University of Washington's website on the Depression, the Federal Works Progress and later Projects Administration alone funded work for 28,000 miles of road, 1,000 bridges, now this is just in Washington, 26 libraries, 193 parks, 380 miles of sewers, 15,500 traffic signs, 90 stadiums, and 760 miles of water mains in Washington. And here's another project you're probably all familiar with in one way or another. This is the Mercer Island Floating Bridge, completed in 1940. 40% of its cost was picked up by the federal government with New Deal funding. Arts projects included Comprehensive Guide to Washington State, art and mural projects by people like Mark Tobey and Kenneth Callahan, a traveling theater group of Black performers, and other theater groups. Public assistance was also provided for the unemployed, along with things like job training programs and school lunches for kids. Perhaps the biggest impact was the construction of Grand Coulee and Bonneville dams, which provided hydropower for electricity, water, irrigation, and enabled the manufacture of low-cost aluminum, which in turn was a boon for Boeing and helped fuel the boom caused by World War II, which put an end to the Depression. It's hard to imagine this recovery without the vast, deep scope of federal aid and intervention at almost every level of society. The next crisis is the Boeing lights out crisis. A recession in the early 1970s gained momentum This recession is known for its iconic billboard put up with a kind of lighthearted, dark sense of humor that asked, will the last person leaving Seattle please turn out the lights? This was Seattle's worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. A sequence of events contributed to it. Boeing employment had risen and fallen over the years, and Seattle was largely a company town in the 1960s and 70s. The company had bet the farm on the new 747, but orders were slow to come in. Federal defense budget cuts also impacted the company, which began laying off people in 1969, but a trickle soon turned into a flood. Boeing laid off 60,000 of its 100,000 workers. Hopes for government contract to develop the supersonic transport were dashed when Congress killed the project. This is despite the best efforts of Scoop Jackson and Warren G. Magnuson. The only legacy of that is the name of our departed yet much loved basketball team, the Seattle Supersonics. As with some crises, recession was not the only thing going on. Protest in the Black community, born out of frustrations with the slowness with which Seattle had dealt with its segregationist past and present. At the same time, anti-war protests grew and some opposition to the war turned violent. Seattle was known for a series of radical bombings and arson attacks. President Richard Nixon pushed Seattle's new mayor, Wes Ullman, to crack down on student radicals and the Black Panthers. Ullman also faced the Boeing recession, and he raised the ire of public service unions with budget cuts. He was the subject of 3 recall efforts. And we think about the attempted recall of Jenny Durkin or Shama Sawant. Ullman was subjected to 3 recall efforts between 1970 and 1974, and he's the last mayor to have his recall go to a public vote. He survived. At the same time, the city and King County were attempting to clean up longstanding police corruption. As Boeing began to recover, the city was faced with the national recession and the oil crisis of 1973 to 1975. But I look at the decade from 1969 to 1979 as one that had many silver linings, despite the difficult beginning. The city made incredible progress in multiple areas. Federal spending, of course, helped in healthcare, research, and transportation projects. But at the grassroots level, consider what blossomed. The first bumper shoot was held. The Seattle Film Festival was launched. The city's parks were transformed by innovative designs like Freeway Park over I-5, Discovery Park at Fort Lawton, Gasworks Park at Lake Union, and the acquisition of the old railroad right-of-way that became the Burke-Gilman Trail. Protests and occupations of public facilities led to the creation of more inclusive community centers like Daybreak Star and El Centro de la Raza. Preservationists won battles to save the Pike Place Market, Pioneer Square, and the Chinatown International District. Neighborhood activism also stopped highway projects like the plan to put an expressway right through the middle of the Arboretum. Local funds improved community infrastructure, including the building of the King Dome. Between 1967 and the mid-70s, the Seattle City Council was overturned by reformers and became more diverse. Starbucks was founded. Medic One was fully launched. Fred Hutch broke ground. The first Gay Pride Week was held. Community pea patches, so popular today, were created. It was a time when much of what we think makes modern Seattle, Seattle was launched by a combination of grassroots activism, entrepreneurship, and civic enthusiasm that was not all top-down. That loyalty to place was shown by many people. A Rand Corporation study in 1973 noted that very few laid off workers left the Puget Sound area due to the recession. Many of those who remained were trained in science and engineering. Seattle was also determined to diversify and never again become solely reliant on a single company. The decade ended with the two Seattle boys shown here, returning to the area in 1979 with their company, Microsoft. So much of what we value in Seattle today is largely a product of the 1970s recovery period, when lights went on rather than going out. I've been speaking broadly and selectively about the crisis and recovery episodes. I won't go into what we're facing now. You can ask me questions about it, and I'll try to answer. But I do think the city is facing a unique and city-changing series of challenges, not unlike some of the ones that we talked about. But here are a few takeaways that I think are lessons for now. Dig in and stay determined. The Puget Sound area is a very sticky place. So I think people are prone to stay and work things out. You can think big. I think of, it was Dwight Eisenhower who said, if you can't solve a problem, make it bigger. I think sometimes we need to look at the big picture rather than the obvious problem right in front of us. Listen to activists and turn their ideas into pragmatic solutions. Raise and spend money. Get federal help. See above, raise and spend money. Promote grassroots creativity. A lot of the wonderful things I mentioned that happened in the 70s recovery period were grassroots efforts. I think it's very important to think a lot about small business, starting small businesses, and keeping things going at a creative economic level at the grassroots. Think for the long term. I think again about that Seattle fire and the kind of consensus when the city came together and said, okay, we faced this huge disaster. Now what do? They made a whole sequence of decisions that had a profound long-term effect. I mentioned the public water supply. Seattle is the envy of cities around the world for owning not just the water supply, but the watershed that provides the water in the first place. This was controversial, but very forward thinking. And it came out of something that we could have responded to in a very uncreative and undynamic way. My last point is build region-wide bridges and don't go it alone. I think Seattle sometimes has a tendency to think of itself going back to that idea there's only one city on Puget Sound. And Seattle, I think, sometimes has the idea that there's only one city on Puget Sound that matters, and it's us. I think many of the solutions to problems that we're facing are going to have a series of regional solutions, and Seattle sometimes could use an ambassador to represent itself to many of the people around the state who think we're crazy and misguided. Anyway, that's my talk. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm more than happy to answer questions or talk about any of the things about Seattle history and what we're facing today.
Thank you so much, Skip. That's a terrific talk. I always enjoy hearing you speak, and fantastic. We have had a few questions coming in, and I'll pitch those to you if you're willing.
Yeah, absolutely.
What would Seattle history indicate how we are going to handle our homelessness crisis?
So I think it would indicate some of what I've said here in terms of the lessons, which is you have to think big. You can't simply chase homeless people from one town to another or put them on a bus and dump them one place or another. the crisis that we're going through is also much different than the Great Depression. In the Great Depression, Hooverville, and there were more than one Hooverville, by the way. There were a number of them spread in different parts of Seattle and even outside Seattle. But we all think of the big one down at Soto as being sort of iconic. Most of the people there were men, and they were laborers. This was, the era where guys with do a lot of the heavy lifting of building infrastructure and whatnot. Today's homeless crisis, I think, is more systemic in terms of the economic system and what it takes to be able to make a good income and be employed. I think we have a lot of people on the streets who have substance abuse issues, mental health issues. So I just think that it's a national problem. It's particularly bad in certain places. We have to approach it regionally. And I think ultimately, not just for the homeless issue, but also just in general terms, in terms of housing, I think we're going to have to spend a ton of money and put a lot of muscle into building public housing. I don't think the market can solve some of the issues related to the homeless problem. I think we're going to need massive public housing, and we know this can be done. We did it before. When the housing boom surrounding World War II and the extent of housing that was built for workers to accommodate them in defense businesses. Yesler Terrace, which was one of the very first integrated public housing projects in Seattle, in the nation, was built in Seattle right before the war. They were able to house 3,000 people very quickly. So I don't think we're doing everything that we can do, and we certainly aren't treating it like the emergency it is. But it's complicated and it's big, and I think it's going to take a kind of New Deal style effort to get us out of the hole that we're in.
Thank you for that one. Now a slightly different twist, going back a few more years. Wasn't Lou Graham the second successful famous madam? What was the true name of Madam Damnable?
Yeah, I can't remember her first name or her actual name. Madam or Mother Damnable was another version of her name, and she ran a hotel of dubious reputation. One of Seattle's first houses of ill fame. What was her name? I'm drawing a blank. I'm sorry.
Not to worry. We have another question here, and I think you've kind of touched on this one slightly, but with homelessness. But maybe there's another thought you have about another an answer to this. What does Seattle need to do that it's not doing?
Boy, that's a great question. I think I had a really interesting talk a while ago with Norm Rice, who was really a really good mayor of Seattle in many respects, and a wonderful person. And I asked him, this was last fall when we talked a couple of times, but and I asked him about what did Seattle need because of the divisiveness. And Rice talked about some of the divisiveness early in his career. And I said, what kind of mayor do we need? And he said, we need a healer. He said, that people get sort of entrenched on either side of an issue. They're activists. He said, what you don't want to get into is a situation where you have a sort of prosecutorial personalities trying to solve the problems. What you need is somebody who can bring people together. And the fact is, whatever problems Seattle's facing, and I think it's facing significant problems, particularly, well, with, as has already been mentioned, homelessness, but also with downtown and safety, but also the economic future of downtown. You need somebody who can bring everyone together. It can bring the activists together, that can bring the business community together, the environmental community. You need someone, and someone who can do that and has a kind of visionary pragmatism that can get people past some of these very divisive issues. And so it'll be interesting to watch the mayor's race and see how the candidates position themselves, how they evolve. But I thought that was a really good piece of advice. We need somebody who can heal, who can bring together, and who is not demonizing any members of the opposition, because, boy, you need people of all kinds in order to solve our problems. So I think it remains to be seen whether Seattle will go down that path. I certainly hope we head down that path. Politics can make that difficult sometimes, but I don't think we have a choice. So.
Thank you. That's excellent. You also mentioned think for the long term. What are the long-term things we should be thinking about?
Well, one of the things that comes to mind, for me anyway, in thinking about downtown, when are people going to be back in those buildings working? What kind of public safety can be guaranteed? When will the cruise ships come back? I mean, you can look at sort of what it is and when are they going to come back together. I've always, I won't say always, but I've been intrigued about, the waterfront is really the sort of big development project. It's underway. It's on it's moving on a timetable I wish we could speed up. I was talking with Bob Donegan of Ivers, and I asked him, I said, well, why can't it be sped up by a year or two? Can it, be put into hyperdrive? Well, apparently there are a lot of reasons why it can't be sped up. But I think it has the potential to be transformative for part of downtown. The question is, will the downtown we need in the future be, is it being created to a vision that's in some way outdated just by how people will live and work in the post-pandemic world? I don't know that it is. It's just a question. I think if we think of big projects, like, it seems to me like this idea of essentially putting I-5 through downtown, lidding it, and creating open space, park space, space for new housing right in the core of downtown, and sort of healing that wound. It's like we're healing the wound of the waterfront with the viaduct and outdated port. Could we do the same thing on the other side of downtown and heal that incredible wound between Capitol Hill and First Hill and the International District with something very dynamic, very creative, long-term, that would be a major improvement and give us some of the things that we could really use in terms of space, in terms of new land, essentially, on which we could put lots of housing and other things. So I just think it's a time when, let's think let's think big. Let's think big on homelessness. Let's think big on something like the I-5 lid.
Fantastic. And we've had a comment come in that Madam Damnable's name was Marianne Boyer or Conklin.
Conklin.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
And,
That's what.
yeah.
That's what.
And she was the manager of the Felker House, I guess. So
The Felker House. Yes. I remember reading, I think in Lorraine McConaughey's book, that the Felker House was off limits to the sailors that came in the Decatur, the naval warship that defended Seattle during the so-called Battle of Seattle when it was attacked by Native peoples in the 1850s. And I heard one story about Madame Damnable, and I'm not sure if it's true, but she was buried originally in Denny Park, which was a cemetery, and the city dug everybody up and moved them. I think she went up to Lakeview Cemetery. Correct me if I'm wrong. And I've always thought that that park was a little dreary, and maybe it's haunted. But they said that when they dug Madame Damnable up, she had turned to stone. Fantastic.
Fantastic.
Great rumor, anyway.
Oh, fantastic. Well, Knute, this has been a fantastic evening tonight. You've been a really terrific presenter, really enjoyed your talk. And I've had countless comments in the chat and also on my on phone by text to convey to you how much everyone has appreciated your talk. Several people have said this is the best talk we've ever had. So thank you very much from all of us at the Norwegian Commercial Club. And we didn't have Fisherman's Night this year, and I know you've been in the past, but we'll hope to have you this December when we have Fisherman's Night again, and welcome you back to the club.
Yeah, well, I'll keep my fingers crossed that we can do that in safety, like we used to.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again for being here tonight.
Thanks. Thank you so much for asking me to speak. I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you all.
Fabulous. Thank you. Well, everyone, good night and good night again. Knute, thank you for being here, and thank you all for coming to this talk tonight, and for your support of the Norwegian Commercial Club. President Debbie asked me to share with you that we do plan to have a get-together in May or June, depending on what COVID will allow. And so stay tuned. We'll be in touch. Our hope is to do something even outdoors if we can. And we know you all miss getting together, and so do we. So we're actively working on that. So in the meantime, everyone stay safe and stay healthy, and we look forward to getting together soon. Have a good evening.